The silence after the storm. When dawn broke on June 27, 1876, the summer air still carried the metallic scent of gunpowder over the rolling hills of Montana Territory. The waters of the Little Bighorn River, usually pristine and clear, now flowed past the scattered remains of one of the most stunning military defeats in American history. As Native American warriors rode back to their camps in triumph, and the few surviving U.S. soldiers emerged from their defensive positions, neither side could fully grasp how this single battle would reshape the narrative of the American West forever. In the eerie stillness of dawn on June 27, 1876, General Terry's relief column approached the Little Bighorn battlefield through a landscape that would forever haunt those who witnessed it. The morning mist, tinged with the lingering smoke of spent gunpowder, gradually revealed a scene of unprecedented devastation that would etch itself into American history. Major Marcus Reno and Captain Frederick Benteen's surviving troops, who had endured a harrowing siege on the hilltop, were the first to witness the full scope of the tragedy as they ventured down to search for their fallen comrades. The sight that greeted them was beyond their darkest expectations. Scattered across the undulating Montana terrain lay the fallen soldiers of the 7th Cavalry, their bodies telling silent stories of the battle's final moments. The discovery of Lieutenant Colonel George Armstrong Custer's body, alongside his brothers Tom and Boston, nephew Harry Reed, and brother-in-law James Calhoun, painted a grim picture of the battle's climactic moments. Custer was found near the top of what would later be known as Last Stand Hill, 2 gunshot wounds marking his body, one near his heart and another at his left temple. Unlike tales of mutilation that would later circulate, his body was largely untouched, a sign of respect that some Native American warriors accorded to brave opponents. The task of identifying and recovering the dead fell to the surviving members of the 7th Cavalry, many of whom were forced to recognize the faces of men they'd shared meals with just days before. The summer heat had taken its toll on the bodies, making identification an increasingly urgent and emotionally taxing task. Soldiers moved methodically across the battlefield, marking each location where a comrade had fallen, creating the first rough map of the battle's final moments. Lieutenant Edward McClernand, one of the first officers to arrive with Terry's column, documented the scene in his field notebook. His words captured the profound impact of witnessing such wholesale destruction. The dead lay as they had fought, line behind line, showing where defensive positions had been successively taken up and held until none were left to fight. The military precision that had characterized the 7th Cavalry in life was still visible in death, their final formations frozen in time across the Montana landscape. Native American accounts, later collected by historians, reveal that most warriors had departed the battlefield by sunrise on June 26th, taking their dead and wounded with them. They left behind numerous artifacts of their victory, dropped cartridge cases, broken arrows, and personal items that would later help piece together the battle's progression. The massive encampment that had housed thousands of Lakota, Cheyenne, and Arapaho people had disappeared into the landscape, leaving only trampled grass and scattered remnants as evidence of their presence. The process of burying the dead began almost immediately. The summer heat and the vast number of casualties made it impossible to transport the bodies back to a military post. Most soldiers were buried where they fell, in shallow graves marked with stakes. Custer's body, along with those of his officers, received slightly more elaborate burials, though still hastily executed given the conditions. These initial burials would prove temporary, as many families would later request the return of their loved ones' remains for reburial elsewhere. Lieutenant John Bourke, arriving with General Terry's column, noted the professionalism with which the surviving soldiers conducted themselves, despite their visible grief. He wrote of men working silently, mechanically, their faces set in grim determination as they carried out their somber duty. Their only sounds were the rhythmic thud of shovels hitting earth, and the occasional sharp order from an officer directing the burial details. The documentation of the battlefield began almost immediately. Lieutenant Edward McGuire of the Engineers Corps began surveying the site, creating detailed maps that would later prove invaluable to historians. Field surgeons examined the dead, document wounds, and create medical reports that would later help reconstruct the battle's events. Officers collected personal effects, letters, photographs, watches, and rings to be returned to grieving families back east. As news of the disaster spread, more soldiers and civilians began arriving at the battlefield. Among them were newspaper correspondents who would send the first detailed accounts of the aftermath to a shocked nation. Their reports, though sometimes sensationalized, captured the raw emotion of those first few days, the smell of death under the hot Montana sun, the sight of personal items scattered across the battlefield, and the profound silence that seemed to envelop the entire region. The initial military reports, hastily written in the field, struggled to make sense of what had happened. The absence of survivors from Custer's immediate command meant that crucial details of the battle's final moments would forever remain a mystery. Officers pieced together what they could from the physical evidence, the positions of the bodies, and the accounts of the surviving troops from Reno and Benteen's commands. As the sun set on those first crucial days after the battle, the immediate work of recovery and documentation was largely complete. The dead were buried, their positions recorded, and the first official reports were on their way to Washington. But the impact of what had happened along the Little Bighorn River was only beginning to ripple outward. The aftermath of those first few days would set in motion a chain of events that would transform the American West, reshape U.S. Indian policy, and create a cultural touchstone that would be debated and discussed for generations to come. When the first telegrams bearing news of the Little Bighorn disaster reached the East Coast, they arrived amid the nation's centennial celebrations. The stark contrast between jubilant 4th of July festivities and reports of Custer's annihilation created a physical shockwave that reverberated through American society. In Philadelphia, where thousands had gathered to celebrate the country's 100th birthday, the festive atmosphere turned somber as newspaper boys shouted the headlines that would forever change the nation's perception of its westward expansion. General Alfred Terry's official report to Washington, delivered in characteristically measured military prose, belied the emotional impact of the news. His words, "It is my painful duty to report," began a document that would shake the foundations of military and political establishments. The report, arriving on President Grant's desk during a sweltering July morning, prompted an immediate cabinet meeting. Grant, who had privately harbored doubts about Custer's judgment, now faced a public relations catastrophe that threatened to overshadow his administration's final months in office. Eastern newspapers seized upon the story with unprecedented fervor. The New York Herald's front page screamed "Massacre" in bold typeface, while the Chicago Tribune devoted entire sections to biographical sketches of the fallen officers. These initial reports, often based on incomplete information and colored by racial prejudices of the era, painted lurid pictures of savage warfare that inflamed public sentiment. Editors, sensing the public's appetite for details, dispatched special correspondents to Montana, their telegraphed reports consuming precious column inches and dominating public discourse for weeks. In the halls of Congress, politicians who had previously shown little interest in frontier affairs now demanded immediate action. Senator William Stewart of Nevada thundered from the Senate floor, "The blood of our soldiers cries out for vengeance." His words echoed the growing public sentiment that called for swift and decisive retribution against the Native American tribes. Congressional committees hastily convened hearings, summoning military experts and Indian agents to testify about the conditions that had led to this devastating defeat. The public's reaction was complex and multifaceted. In the East, where many had never encountered Native Americans, the battle fed into existing fears and prejudices. Ladies' aid societies organized benefits for widows and orphans of the 7th Cavalry, while citizens wrote passionate letters to their congressional representatives demanding increased military presence on the frontier. The battle became a rallying cry for those who advocated for more aggressive Indian policies. Yet, in some quarters, particularly among reform-minded intellectuals and religious leaders, the disaster prompted soul-searching about the nation's treatment of Native Americans. The Boston Globe published a series of editorials questioning the wisdom of current Indian policies, while religious journals called for a more humane approach to tribal relations. These voices, though initially drowned out by calls for revenge, would eventually influence the reform movements of the late 19th century. Military circles buzzed with professional analysis and criticism. Officers who had long questioned Custer's tactics found their opinions suddenly in demand. Veterans of frontier campaigns wrote detailed critiques for professional journals, dissecting every known detail of the battle. The Army and Navy Journal, a leading military publication, ran a series of articles examining the strategic and tactical lessons of the defeat, sparking heated debates among officers about cavalry doctrine and Indian fighting techniques. President Grant's administration faced mounting pressure to respond decisively. The president, himself a celebrated military commander, understood the complex realities of frontier warfare better than most politicians. However, public opinion demanded action, and Grant found himself authorizing additional troops and resources for the Department of Dakota. His military advisors scrambled to develop new strategies for dealing with what was now perceived as a major threat to Western settlement. The battle's impact on national policies was immediate and lasting. Democrats, seeking to capitalize on the disaster, blamed Republican Indian policies for the defeat. They pointed to corruption in the Indian Bureau and accused the administration of incompetence in handling frontier affairs. These political attacks, coming during an election year, forced both parties to address Indian policy in their platforms, though their proposed solutions often reflected more political expediency than practical wisdom. In the nation's newspapers, artists worked feverishly to produce illustrations of the battle and its aftermath. Without photographs of the actual engagement, these dramatic renderings shaped public perception of events. The images, often more imaginative than accurate, depicted heroic last stands and savage warfare, creating lasting impressions that would influence American popular culture for generations. The business community also responded to the crisis. Gun manufacturers saw orders increase as Western settlements demanded arms for self-defense. Railroad companies, concerned about the security of their western routes, lobbied for increased military protection. The battle even influenced fashion, as Eastern manufacturers began producing frontier-style clothing and accessories, capitalizing on renewed public interest in the West. As summer turned to fall, the immediate shock of the Little Bighorn began to transform into something more lasting, a fundamental shift in how Americans viewed their nation's expansion westward. The confident assumption of manifest destiny gave way to a more complex understanding of the challenges and costs of continental conquest. The battle became more than a military disaster. It emerged as a cultural watershed, marking the end of one era in American history and the beginning of another. The public reaction to the Little Bighorn would continue to shape policy and perception for decades to come, influencing everything from military reform to popular culture. The immediate aftermath set in motion changes that would ultimately transform the American West, though few who read those first shocking headlines could have predicted the full scope of the battle's lasting impact on the national consciousness. The blood spilled at Little Bighorn became the catalyst for one of the most sweeping military reforms in American frontier history. In the aftermath of Custer's defeat, the United States Army found itself forced to fundamentally reimagine its approach to frontier warfare. The embarrassment of losing an entire battalion to Native American forces demanded not just a response, but a complete transformation of military doctrine, strategy, and operations. In the smoke-filled rooms of the War Department, generals pored over maps and reports, their faces grave as they confronted the brutal reality of their tactical obsolescence. The old ways of conducting cavalry operations, the dramatic charges, the divided commands, the reliance on outdated European cavalry tactics had proved catastrophically inadequate against the sophisticated fighting methods of the Plains tribes. General Philip Sheridan, commander of the Military Division of the Missouri, issued a series of revolutionary directives that would reshape frontier military operations for decades to come. The first and most immediate change was the abandonment of small unit operations. No longer would cavalry companies ride out alone into hostile territory. New protocols demanded that units operate in concentrated strength, with multiple companies working in coordinated movements. The image of the dashing cavalry officer leading a small detachment on a glory-seeking mission was replaced by the more prudent reality of large, well-supplied columns operating with mutual support. Communication became paramount in this new era of frontier warfare. The Army established a network of heliograph stations across the western territories, using mirrors to flash messages across vast distances. These stations, perched on high points and staffed round the clock, created a web of information that could track Native American movements and coordinate military responses. The days of isolated commands operating without knowledge of their supporting forces were over. Training underwent a radical transformation as well. The Army's Cavalry School at Fort Riley, Kansas, completely revised its curriculum. Officers who had once spent hours perfecting their saber technique now found themselves studying Native American warfare tactics, learning to read terrain like their adversaries, and mastering the art of fighting dismounted when circumstances demanded. The emphasis shifted from glamorous charges to practical combat effectiveness. Supply lines, which had proved so valuable in past campaigns, received particular attention. New regulations required cavalry units to travel with packed mules carrying additional ammunition and supplies, eliminating the need for vulnerable wagon trains that could slow movement and restrict access to rough terrain. This change allowed cavalry units to maintain mobility while increasing their operational endurance in the field. Perhaps most significantly, the Army began to recruit Native American scouts more systematically than ever before. The expertise of these scouts, many from tribes traditionally hostile to the Plains nations, proved invaluable. They brought an intimate knowledge of terrain, tracking skills, and an understanding of Native American warfare that no West Point education could provide. Their integration into military operations marked a subtle but important shift in how the Army approached frontier warfare. Weapons and equipment also evolved in response to the lessons learned at Little Bighorn. The Army began to favor repeating rifles over single-shot weapons, acknowledging the superior firepower that Native American warriors had often possessed. New cavalry carbines were issued, and soldiers were drilled relentlessly in their use. The emphasis on mounted combat shifted to include more training in dismounted fighting tactics, recognizing that horses could be as much a liability as an asset in certain terrain. Field fortification became a standard part of cavalry operations. Officers were trained to quickly establish defensive positions, using natural terrain and hasty entrenchments to create strong points that could withstand sustained attacks. The memory of Major Reno's men, desperately digging in with tin cups and bare hands on the bluffs above the Little Bighorn, drove home the importance of this training. The size of frontier posts was increased, and their positioning became more strategic. No longer were small isolated forts considered adequate. The Army began consolidating its presence into larger, better supplied installations that could support extended operations and serve as effective bases for the new, larger cavalry units. These posts were positioned to control key terrain and water sources, essential for both military operations and Native American movement. Weather monitoring and seasonal planning became crucial elements of military strategy. The disaster at Little Bighorn had demonstrated the folly of conducting major operations without considering environmental conditions. New protocols required commanders to factor in seasonal patterns, weather forecasts, and terrain conditions when planning operations. The Army would no longer find itself caught in vulnerable positions during the harsh winters or spring thaws of the northern plains. These changes didn't happen overnight, nor were they implemented without resistance. Old Guard officers sometimes chafed at the new restrictions and requirements, seeing them as an impediment to decisive action. But the memory of Little Bighorn, of the price paid for underestimating their adversaries, provided a powerful argument for reform. The transformation of frontier military operations marked the beginning of a more modern, systematic approach to warfare that would influence American military doctrine well into the 20th century. The ultimate test of these reforms came in the campaigns that followed, as the Army pursued the Sioux, Cheyenne, and other tribes across the northern plains. The new tactics proved effective, if not dramatically so, gradually wearing down Native American resistance through persistent coordinated operations rather than decisive battles. The Romantic era of frontier cavalry warfare was over, replaced by a more methodical, professional approach that would eventually prove instrumental in completing the conquest of the American West. The triumph at Little Bighorn, which had initially filled Native American hearts with fierce pride and hope, proved to be a bittersweet victory that ultimately accelerated their people's tragedy. As the summer days of 1876 faded into autumn, the great coalition of tribes that had stood together against Custer began to fragment under the weight of an unprecedented military response. The victory that had seemed so decisive in June became, in retrospect, the beginning of the end for the free Roman life of the Plains tribes. Sitting Bull, a spiritual leader who had foreseen Custer's defeat in a vision, watched as his great alliance began to unravel. The massive camp that had gathered at Little Bighorn, perhaps the largest congregation of Plains Indians in recorded history, could not sustain itself in the face of intensified military pursuit. Food became scarcer, as the Army's presence made traditional buffalo hunting increasingly dangerous. The harsh reality of survival began to override the euphoria of victory. The U.S. Army's response was relentless and methodical. General Nelson Miles launched a winter campaign that would prove devastating to the Native American resistance. Unlike previous commanders, Miles was willing to pursue the tribes through the brutal Montana winter, denying them the seasonal respite they had traditionally enjoyed. His troops, better equipped and following reformed military protocols, maintained constant pressure on the bands attempting to remain free. Crazy Horse, the brilliant military tactician who had helped orchestrate the victory at Little Bighorn, found his options increasingly limited. The warrior's path, which had served his people for generations, was becoming untenable in the face of overwhelming military force. The Army's new tactics of sustained pursuit meant that villages could no longer find safe haven, even in the most remote regions of the northern plains. The constant movement required to evade military columns made it impossible to gather adequate food and supplies. The pressure began to show in tragic ways. Children and elderly members of the tribe suffered terribly during the harsh winter of 1876-77. Food became so scarce that some bands were forced to eat their horses, a desperate measure that struck at the very heart of Plains culture and mobility. The proud warriors who had triumphed at Little Bighorn now watched helplessly as their families faced starvation and exposure. One by one, smaller bands began breaking away from the main group, some seeking refuge in Canada, others reluctantly making their way to the reservations. The military strategy of dividing the alliance proved effective, as individual bands faced the impossible choice between continued resistance and the survival of their people. Each surrender weakened the remaining resistance, making it harder for those still fighting to maintain their independence. The impact on tribal leadership was profound. Traditional chiefs found their authority challenged, as younger members of their bands advocated for different responses to the crisis. Some pushed for continued resistance, while others argued for accommodation with the changing times. These internal conflicts further weakened tribal unity and accelerated the breakdown of traditional social structures. Reservation life presented its own set of challenges and humiliations. Proud warriors who had once roamed freely across the plains now found themselves confined to designated areas, dependent on government rations, and subject to the authority of Indian agents. The transition was particularly difficult for the veterans of Little Bighorn, who had to live with the knowledge that their greatest victory had paradoxically hastened their people's confinement. The spiritual impact was equally devastating. Traditional religious practices, many of which required freedom of movement to sacred sites, became difficult or impossible to maintain under reservation restrictions. The ghost dance movement, which emerged in the years following Little Bighorn, reflected the desperate hope for supernatural intervention to restore the old way of life. This, too, would end in tragedy at Wounded Knee in 1890. Perhaps most poignantly, the very landscape that had witnessed the triumph at Little Bighorn was transformed. The free-ranging buffalo herds, essential to Plains Indian life, were systematically destroyed. The open prairies were increasingly carved up by railroad lines and settler communities. The physical space that had made the nomadic lifestyle possible was irreversibly altered. The process of adaptation was both painful and profound. Some, like Sitting Bull, maintained their resistance until the end, refusing to fully accept the new reality imposed upon their people. Others, recognizing the inevitability of change, sought to navigate a path between preserving their cultural identity and adapting to new circumstances. Young people were sent to government schools, traditional practices went underground, and survival often meant finding ways to maintain cultural identity within the confines of reservation life. Within a generation of Little Bighorn, the free roaming life of the Plains tribes had largely vanished. The victory that had seemed to promise the preservation of their way of life had instead marked the beginning of its end. The bitter irony was not lost on the survivors and their descendants. The greatest military triumph had unleashed forces that would ultimately transform their world beyond recognition. Yet, in this transformation, the spirit of resistance and cultural preservation found new forms of expression. The legacy of Little Bighorn, while marking the end to one chapter in Native American history, also became a symbol of resilience and a reminder of a time when the Plains tribes had stood together in defense of their way of life. This memory, passed down through generations, would help sustain cultural identity through the difficult transitions that followed. The cultural impact of the Little Bighorn battle reverberated through American society like aftershocks from an earthquake, creating ripples that would shape the nation's understanding of itself for generations to come. In the immediate aftermath, as the nation struggled to comprehend the magnitude of the defeat, a peculiar transformation began to take place. The story of Custer's last stand evolved from a military disaster into something far more potent, a cultural touchstone that would capture the American imagination for over a century. In the saloons of the eastern cities and the homesteader cabins of the frontier, the battle was retold and reimagined countless times. Each telling added layers to what would become known as the Custer myth. The flamboyant cavalry officer, whose actual career had been marked by both brilliant success and controversial failures, was transformed in death into a larger-than-life figure. The press, which had often criticized him while alive, now portrayed him as the quintessential American hero, brave, daring, and ultimately martyred in the cause of civilization's advance. Early historical accounts of the battle reflected the biases and limitations of their time. Elizabeth Custer, the general's widow, became a powerful force in shaping her husband's legacy. Her books, including Boots and Saddles and Following the Guidon, painted an intimate portrait of Army life and her husband's character that would influence historians for decades. Her tireless efforts to protect and enhance Custer's reputation helped establish the romantic version of events that would dominate popular understanding for generations. The battlefield itself became a place of pilgrimage and controversy. In 1879, just 3 years after the battle, the first memorial was erected over the mass grave containing the reburied soldiers. The site's transformation into a national cemetery, and later a national monument, reflected changing attitudes towards the battle's significance. Yet for decades, the official interpretation of the site focused almost exclusively on the military perspective, with little acknowledgement of the Native American victory or its context. Artists found in the battle an inexhaustible source of inspiration. Painters like Edgar Samuel Paxson and others created dramatic depictions of Custer's last stand that would shape public imagination of the event. These paintings, often featuring Custer in heroic pose, surrounded by attacking warriors, bore little resemblance to the actual battle, but became the definitive images in the public mind. They adorned barroom walls, appeared in history books, and were reproduced as prints that hung in countless American homes. The entertainment industry seized upon the story with equal enthusiasm. Buffalo Bill's Wild West show featured reenactments of the battle, with Native American participants who had actually fought at Little Bighorn sometimes playing themselves, though notably they were often asked to play the role of the defeated rather than the victors. These performances, seen by millions across America and Europe, helped cement a particular narrative of the battle in popular culture. Meanwhile, Native American oral histories told a very different story. In their accounts, passed down through generations, the battle was remembered not as Custer's last stand, but as the Battle of the Greasy Grass, a name that emphasized their perspective and victory. These narratives, largely ignored by early historians, provided crucial details about the battle and offered a counterpoint to the prevailing white narrative. They spoke of strategic brilliance, of warriors fighting to protect their families, and of a victory that, while momentous, carried the seeds of future tragedy. Academic historians gradually began to challenge the traditional narrative. New research methodologies, archaeological discoveries, and a growing willingness to incorporate Native American perspectives led to more nuanced interpretations of the battle. The simple story of heroic cavalry versus savage warriors gave way to complex discussions of military tactics, cultural conflict, and the larger context of American expansion. The battlefield itself became a laboratory for changing historical interpretation. Archaeological investigations, beginning in the 1980s, revealed new details about the battle's progression and challenged many long-held assumptions. The discovery of artifacts, including cartridge cases and personal items, helped piece together a more accurate picture of the battle's final moments. These findings often contradicted both the romantic myths and the official military accounts. The evolution of the battle's interpretation reflected broader changes in American society. As the civil rights movement and Native American activism gained momentum in the 20th century, new voices challenged the traditional narrative. The Battle of Little Bighorn became a focal point for discussions about colonialism, cultural preservation, and historical justice. The site's name change, from Custer Battlefield to Little Bighorn Battlefield National Monument in 1991, symbolized this shift in perspective. The cultural legacy of Little Bighorn continues to evolve. Modern interpretations acknowledge the complexity of the event and its participants. Custer is no longer universally seen as either hero or fool, but as a complex figure whose actions and decisions reflected the contradictions of his era. Similarly, the Native American victory is understood not simply as a military achievement, but as part of a larger struggle for cultural survival that continues to resonate today. This ongoing reinterpretation demonstrates how historical events can acquire layers of meaning far beyond their immediate significance. The Battle of Little Bighorn remains a powerful symbol, but what it symbolizes depends increasingly on who is telling the story. In this way, the battle's cultural legacy continues to evolve, reflecting changing understanding of America's past and its implications for the present. The aftermath of Little Bighorn reshaped American Indian policy with the force of a prairie thunderstorm, sweeping away decades of inconsistent approaches and ushering in an era of unprecedented federal control over Native American life. In the smoke-filled rooms of Washington, politicians and bureaucrats who had previously paid little attention to the Indian problem now scrambled to implement dramatic changes that would reshape the relationship between the United States and indigenous peoples for generations to come. Secretary of the Interior Carl Schurz, assuming office in 1877, inherited a system in chaos. The shocking defeat at Little Bighorn had exposed the fundamental flaws in the nation's approach to Native American relations. Corruption ran rampant through the Indian Bureau, with agents skimming supplies meant for reservations and political appointees more interested in personal gain than effective administration. Schurz's first actions were swift and decisive, launching investigations that would lead to the dismissal of dozens of corrupt officials. The reservation system, which had existed before Little Bighorn, underwent a dramatic transformation. No longer were reservations seen merely as temporary holding areas for native peoples. They became instruments of forced cultural change, designed to break down traditional tribal structures and replace them with systems more aligned with American society. The government's new approach was embodied in the philosophy of kill the Indian, save the man, a cruel paradox that would define federal policy for decades to come. Congress moved with unprecedented speed to pass new legislation affecting Native American lives. The Indian Appropriations Act of 1871 had already ended the practice of treating tribes as independent nations, but post-Little Bighorn policies went further. New laws restricted Native American movement, regulated tribal governments, and imposed American legal systems on reservation lands. The goal was clear: to prevent any possibility of another military challenge to federal authority. Education became a weapon of cultural transformation. The government expanded its system of Indian boarding schools, forcibly removing children from their families and tribal communities. These institutions, often hundreds of miles from reservations, were designed to erase tribal identities and replace them with American values. Children were forbidden to speak their native languages, wear traditional clothing, or practice their religious beliefs. The psychological impact of this policy would echo through generations. The allocation of reservation lands underwent a radical shift. The government abandoned its previous policy of communal tribal lands in favor of individual allotments. The Dawes Act of 1887, though passed a decade after Little Bighorn, was a direct result of the changed attitude toward Native American autonomy. By breaking up tribal lands into individual parcels, officials hoped to destroy the collective tribal identity that had made resistance possible. Economic policies on reservations became more restrictive. Traditional hunting was increasingly limited, forcing dependency on government rations. The distribution of these supplies became a tool of control, with rations withheld from families who refused to comply with new regulations. The once proud warriors who had triumphed at Little Bighorn watched helplessly as their people were reduced to standing in lines for government beef and flour. Religious freedom, a fundamental right for other Americans, was severely curtailed for Native peoples. Traditional ceremonies were banned, medicine men were persecuted, and tribal spiritual practices were driven underground. The ghost dance movement, which emerged as a response to these restrictions, was met with violent suppression, culminating in the massacre at Wounded Knee in 1890. The administration of justice on reservations became increasingly draconian. Indian police forces, staffed by tribal members but answering to white agents, were expanded. Traditional methods of conflict resolution were replaced by American-style courts. The authority of tribal chiefs, already undermined by reservation policies, was further eroded by these new systems of control. Health care and medical services, though promised in treaties, became another means of enforcing compliance. Doctors and nurses on reservations were expected to report on tribal activities and encourage the adoption of white customs. Traditional healing practices were discouraged or banned outright, forcing Native peoples to rely on often inadequate government medical services. The impact on tribal governance was profound. National leadership structures, which had evolved over centuries to meet the needs of nomadic plains life, were dismantled. In their place, the government imposed new systems of tribal councils, often selecting leaders who would be compliant with federal policies. The resultant power struggles within tribes created divisions that would persist for generations. Agricultural policy became a tool of cultural transformation. The government pushed farming on peoples who had been nomadic hunters for centuries. Seeds, tools, and livestock were distributed, but often without adequate training or consideration of local conditions. The failure of many of these agricultural initiatives only deepened tribal dependency on government support. The changes in Indian policy after Little Bighorn represented more than just a shift in administration. They marked a fundamental transformation in how the United States government viewed its relationship with native peoples. The goal was no longer merely to control tribal movements or prevent warfare. It was to completely reshape Native American society. The victory at Little Bighorn, which had momentarily seemed to preserve traditional ways of life, instead triggered a massive federal response that would accelerate the destruction of those very traditions. These policies, implemented in the shadow of Little Bighorn, would continue to influence Native American life well into the 20th century. Their legacy can still be felt today in the ongoing struggles over tribal sovereignty, cultural preservation, and self-determination. The battle that had begun with gunfire on the Montana plains continued in the form of laws, regulations, and policies that would reshape Native American life more profoundly than any military defeat. Each shovelful of Montana earth revealed new secrets, as archaeologists meticulously uncovered the layers of history buried beneath the Little Bighorn battlefield. The systematic exploration of this hallowed ground, beginning in earnest with the first major archaeological survey in 1984, would revolutionize our understanding of what truly happened on that fateful June day in 1876. The marriage of modern science with historical investigation would peel back decades of myth and speculation, revealing a battle far different from the one that had captured the public imagination for over a century. The watershed moment came when a prairie fire swept across the battlefield in 1983, clearing away thick vegetation and exposing evidence that had laid hidden for over a century. The scorched earth revealed a treasure trove of artifacts, cartridge cases, bullets, personal items, and fragments of military equipment. These silent witnesses to history would begin telling a new story, one that would challenge many long-held assumptions about the battle's progression. The discovery of distinct ammunition patterns revolutionized historians' understanding of troop movements. Each cartridge case left a unique marking from the weapon that fired it, creating a forensic fingerprint that allowed archaeologists to track individual soldiers' movements across the battlefield. This evidence revealed that Custer's troops had not made the heroic last stand of legend, but rather had broken into smaller groups that were systematically overwhelmed by superior Native American tactics and numbers. Personal artifacts recovered from the field painted poignant portraits of the battle's human dimension. A carved wooden pipe stem, a handful of glass trade beads, a silver pocket watch stopped at the moment of its owner's death. Each item added depth and complexity to the historical narrative. These weren't just artifacts. They were tangible connections to the men who fought and died on both sides of the conflict. The application of new technologies transformed the battlefield into a vast outdoor laboratory. Ground-penetrating radar revealed previously unknown burial sites and helped identify areas where the intense fighting had occurred. Sophisticated metal detectors, capable of distinguishing between different types of metals, helped researchers locate and identify thousands of artifacts that had eluded earlier searches. Each discovery added another piece to the complex puzzle of the battle's progression. Forensic analysis of recovered human remains provided startling new insights into the battle's final moments. Modern scientific techniques allowed researchers to determine the trajectories of fatal shots, the types of weapons used, and even the order in which some soldiers fell. This evidence often contradicted the romantic notion of soldiers fighting to the last man in an organized defense, suggesting instead a more chaotic and desperate end. The discovery of Native American artifacts forced a reassessment of traditional battle narratives. War clubs, arrow points, and personal items belonging to warriors painted a picture of sophisticated military tactics and organization. The distribution of these artifacts helped confirm oral histories that had long been dismissed by white historians, proving that Native American accounts of the battle were often more accurate than the official military versions. Environmental archaeology revealed crucial details about the battlefield landscape in 1876. Analysis of soil samples, plant remains, and erosion patterns helped researchers understand how the terrain had influenced the battle's outcome. This work showed how Native American warriors had used the land to their advantage, while Custer's troops found themselves trapped in terrain that made their cavalry tactics ineffective. The recovery of cavalry equipment, spurs, saddle parts, horseshoes, allowed researchers to track the movements of mounted troops across the battlefield. This evidence suggested that many of Custer's men had been forced to fight dismounted, their horses either killed or stampeded early in the battle. This finding helped explain why the cavalry unit had proved so vulnerable to attack. Modern ballistic analysis of recovered ammunition provided surprising insights into the weapons used during the battle. The evidence showed that Native American forces often possessed superior firearms to the cavalry, including many repeating rifles. This discovery helped explain the overwhelming firepower that the warriors were able to bring to bear against Custer's troops, who were primarily armed with single-shot carbines. The application of Geographic Information System, or GIS technology, allowed researchers to create detailed maps showing the distribution of artifacts across the battlefield. These maps revealed patterns of movement and combat that had never been visible before, helping to reconstruct the battle's progression with unprecedented accuracy. The technology also helped identify areas of the battlefield that had not yet been thoroughly investigated. Archaeological work continues to yield new discoveries. Each field season brings fresh insights as researchers employ increasingly sophisticated technologies. The use of LiDAR, light detection and ranging, has revealed subtle changes in the battlefield's topography that influence the fighting. Drone surveys have provided new perspectives on the battlefield's layout and helped identify previously unknown features. Perhaps most significantly, archaeological evidence has helped bridge the gap between written records and Native American oral histories. Physical evidence often confirms details from tribal accounts that had been dismissed by early historians, forcing a reevaluation of traditional historical narratives. This convergence of scientific evidence with traditional knowledge has created a richer, more nuanced understanding of the battle. The archaeological exploration of Little Bighorn stands as a testament to the power of scientific investigation to illuminate historical events. Each artifact recovered, each pattern identified, each analysis completed adds another layer to our understanding of this pivotal moment in American history. The work continues today, as new technologies and methodologies promise to reveal even more secrets buried in the Montana soil, ensuring that our understanding of this historic battle continues to evolve. Standing atop Last Stand Hill today, visitors confront a landscape where past and present converge in powerful ways. The wind that whispers through the prairie grass carries echoes of history, while modern interpretive centers and memorial markers tell a story that continues to evolve. The Little Bighorn Battlefield National Monument has transformed from a simple military memorial into a complex space where multiple perspectives on one of America's most significant battles intersect and dialogue. The most visible symbol of this evolution is the Indian Memorial, dedicated in 2003. Its circular design, incorporating traditional Native American symbolism, stands in deliberate contrast to the stark white obelisk that marks the 7th Cavalry's position. The two monuments represent different perspectives on the same historical moment, create a visual dialogue about memory, interpretation, and reconciliation. The names of the Native American warriors who fought and died here are now honored alongside those of the cavalry soldiers, a testament to how our understanding of the battle has matured. Modern interpretation at the site has moved far beyond the simplistic Custer's Last Stand narrative. Park rangers and Native American interpreters work together to present a nuanced view of the battle and its context. Visitors learn not just about military tactics and casualty counts, but about the cultures that clashed here, the policies that led to conflict, and the battle's lasting impact on American and Native American societies. The story is expanded from a single day of combat to encompass centuries of cultural interaction and conflict. The battlefield's landscape itself has become a teaching tool. Carefully placed markers show visitors where key events occurred, while preserving the essential character of the 1876 terrain. Modern technology enhances this experience through smartphone apps and GPS-guided tours that allow visitors to stand in specific locations and hear multiple perspectives on what happened here. These tools make the landscape come alive, helping visitors understand how geography and terrain shape the battle's outcome. Educational programs at the site have evolved to reach diverse audiences. School groups from both Native American reservations and urban areas participate in specialized programs that emphasize different aspects of the battle's significance. Young Native Americans often serve as interns and junior rangers, bringing their cultural perspectives to the site's interpretation. This approach ensures that new generations understand the battle's complexity and its continuing relevance to contemporary issues. The monument has become a place of healing and restoration. Annual ceremonies bring together descendants of warriors and soldiers, transforming former enemies into partners in preserving and interpreting this shared history. Native American elders conduct ceremonies here, reconnecting with ancestral grounds and maintaining spiritual ties to this powerful place. These gatherings help bridge cultural divides and promote understanding between communities that once met here in conflict. Research continues to enhance our understanding of the battle. Archaeologists employ new technologies to uncover artifacts and evidence, while historians work with Native American communities to document oral histories and traditional knowledge. This ongoing work ensures that the site's interpretation remains dynamic, incorporating new discoveries and perspectives as they emerge. This ongoing work ensures that the site's interpretation remains dynamic, incorporating new discoveries and perspectives as they emerge. The battlefield has become a living laboratory where history is constantly being re-examined and reinterpreted. The monument's visitor center has evolved into a sophisticated educational facility. Interactive exhibits allow visitors to explore different aspects of the battle and its context. Personal stories from both sides humanize the conflict, while detailed explanations of weapons, tactics, and terrain help visitors understand the battle's military aspects. Native American artifacts and cultural displays provide crucial context for understanding why the battle occurred and what was at stake for all participants. Conservation efforts protect both the physical landscape and its cultural significance. Native prairie grasses are being restored, helping visitors understand how the landscape appeared in 1876. Archaeological sites are carefully preserved, while new facilities are designed to minimize their impact on the historic scene. This balance between access and preservation ensures that future generations will be able to connect with this historic place. The site has become a forum for discussing broader issues of American history and identity. Conferences and symposia bring together scholars, tribal representatives, and the public to explore topics ranging from military history to cultural preservation. These discussions often touch on contemporary issues of tribal sovereignty, cultural representation, and historical memory, demonstrating the battle's continuing relevance to modern American life. Perhaps most significantly, the monument has become a place where multiple truths can coexist. The heroism of both cavalry soldiers and Native American warriors is acknowledged. The tragedy of the battle is recognized alongside its historical significance. The site honors both the military discipline of the 7th Cavalry and the warrior traditions of the Plains tribes. This multi-layered interpretation helps visitors understand that historical events often carry different meanings for different communities. As the sun sets over the Little Bighorn battle today, it illuminates a landscape that continues to teach, heal, and inspire. The monument stands as a testament to how our understanding of history can evolve, becoming richer and more inclusive over time. It reminds us that historical sites are not frozen in time, but continue to generate new meanings and insights for each generation that encounters them. In this way, the Battle of the Little Bighorn features not just a historical event, but a living part of America's ongoing dialogue about its past, present, and future.